It was another busy morning in the classroom at the Silver Star Academy, a school on a human colony far from Earth. The walls were lined with shiny screens that glowed with the latest lessons from across the galaxy. Students, both human and alien, filled the seats. The humans, just starting to settle into their new lives on this planet, were still learning the ways of the other species. But today, something was going to go wrong. Very wrong. The teacher, a tall alien named Zorkel, stood at the front of the class. His smooth green skin shimmered slightly under the bright lights, and his wide, three-eyed face was focused on the task at hand. He was a respected educator from a species known for their advanced science. He had taught on many planets, and today he was going to show the students a special experiment. However, he was unaware of one small detail that would lead to disaster. The students were excited. Everyone loved Zorkel's science experiments. His lessons usually involved powerful machines, colorful liquids, or strange gadgets that the students had never seen before. Today, Zorkel was teaching the class how different materials reacted under extreme pressure. He had set up a table at the front of the room, covered with strange vials and tools. One of those tools was a small bottle labeled super adhesive. It was meant to be used for a science demonstration, showing how things could bond quickly when exposed to pressure. The bottle was placed near the edge of the table, right next to a large container that held a mix of different substances. Among the students sat James, a human boy with short brown hair and a quick mind. He was bright, but still not used to all the strange things in his new life on this alien world. Today, he was sitting nervously in his seat, watching as Zorkel prepared the experiment. James had always loved science, but being in a class full of aliens made him feel like he didn't belong. He kept his head down, trying to focus. As Zorkel spoke about the upcoming experiment, his four-fingered hand accidentally brushed against the bottle of super adhesive. The bottle wobbled for a moment, but then with a small bump, it tipped over. The glue poured out, splashing directly onto the table and splattered onto James' hair. James didn't notice at first. He was too focused on Zorkel's words, but soon he felt a strange wetness on his scalp. He reached up, and his fingers instantly stuck to his hair. Panic shot through him as he tried to pull his hand away, but the glue was already setting. His hair, once soft and smooth, was now a stiff mess, stuck in place by the powerful adhesive. The classroom grew silent. The other students began to whisper and giggle, clearly unsure of what was happening. Zorkel, still unaware of the mistake, turned to the board to write some notes. He didn't see what had just occurred. "Mr. Zorkel, I think I need some help," James said quietly, his voice trembling. Zorkel turned around. At first, he didn't understand what James meant. Then he saw the young human's hair standing out in every direction, sticky and stiff with the glue. "Oh," Zorkel exclaimed, his three eyes blinking in surprise. I didn't mean to spill it. It's just a small accident. No harm done, I'm sure." He stepped forward, his long limbs moving gracefully. "I'll clean it up quickly." But as he reached for James' hair, the glue was already setting. It had bonded quickly, and now it was nearly impossible to remove. Zorkel didn't know how strong the glue was, and his attempt to fix the situation only made it worse. James could feel the glue hardening, pulling his hair in different directions. The more he moved, the more stuck he became. James tried to stay calm. "It's okay, Mr. Zorkel, but it's really stuck." The other students in the room were starting to laugh, some quietly, while others whispered among themselves. James felt his face turn red. He didn't want to be the center of attention, especially not for something embarrassing like this. Zorkel looked even more confused. He wasn't used to human reactions. In his species, such accidents were common, and everyone simply laughed it off. But humans were different. He didn't realize the gravity of the situation. "I will make it right," Zorkel said, his voice firm. "I'll fix it. I'll take you to the school nurse." But the glue wasn't just any ordinary adhesive. It was designed for scientific purposes, and it didn't come off easily. Even if they went to the nurse, it might take hours or even days to get it out. James tried to pull at his hair again, but all it did was hurt. "It's stuck," he said quietly, barely able to hide the frustration in his voice. His face turned from embarrassment to worry. What would the other students think of him now? He was just another human in a world full of aliens, and this mistake made him feel even smaller. Zorkel, realizing his mistake, finally stopped moving. I am sorry, he said. I did not mean for this to happen. Please, let me fix this. But James knew that it wasn't that simple. The glue was already setting, and no one in the room seemed to understand how serious the situation was. That's when James heard a voice. James. The voice was strong and familiar. It was his father's voice. The door to the classroom swung open, and in walked a man who everyone instantly recognized. His father, Mr. Harris, was tall and built like a soldier, his face serious but filled with love for his son. He looked around the room and saw what had happened. Is this what I think it is? Mr. Harris asked, his voice calm but sharp. Everyone in the room fell silent. Let me know if you want to tweak anything or need more details added. You said. Part 2. The father arrives. Mr. Harris stood in the doorway of the classroom, his eyes locked on the sight before him. James sat at his desk, his hair stuck out in every direction, covered in a thick layer of super glue. His face was red with embarrassment, and he was clearly struggling to stay calm. The other students watched quietly, some with wide eyes, others still trying to hide their smiles. Mr. Harris wasn't angry, but there was a serious look on his face. He was a man who had seen a lot in his life, and nothing ever really rattled him. He had spent years working in tough conditions, building machines for the human colonies. He had faced challenges, dangers, and setbacks, but none of that mattered now. His son needed him. Without saying a word, Mr. Harris walked across the room, his heavy boots making a firm sound against the floor. The students quickly moved aside to let him pass, sensing the weight of the moment. Mr. Harris didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on James. Dad, James said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and shame. I didn't know what to do. It stuck. Mr. Harris knelt down beside his son, carefully inspecting the mess in his hair. The glue had hardened quickly, and James' once neat brown hair now looked like it had been turned into a strange, sticky sculpture. Mr. Harris could see the worry in his son's eyes. James wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially for something so embarrassing. Zorkel, the teacher, stepped forward, clearly unsure of what to do next. Mr. Harris, he said, his voice apologetic. I am so sorry. This was an accident. I didn't mean for this to happen. I will take James to the nurse immediately and... Stop, Mr. Harris said, his tone calm but firm. You don't understand. This isn't just a simple mistake. This glue isn't like anything I've seen before. It's not coming out easily, and it could be harmful if we don't handle it the right way. Zorkel's 3 eyes widened in confusion. He wasn't used to humans reacting this way. But it's just glue. We can remove it, yes? No, you can't, Mr. Harris replied. This glue is stronger than you think. It bonds instantly and sticks harder the longer it stays. You'll need more than just a nurse to fix this. He stood up, his eyes scanning the room. And this isn't just about fixing James' hair. There's something else going on here, isn't there? Zorkel blinked, clearly trying to understand. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Harris. This was an accident. Mr. Harris didn't respond immediately. He turned to his son, his face softening. James, it's okay. I'm going to take care of this. You're going to be all right. James nodded, grateful but still embarrassed. His father was always so calm, so sure of himself. Even in moments like this, when things went wrong, Mr. Harris never seemed to lose control. It made James feel a little better, but the glue still felt like a heavy weight on his head. Mr. Harris turned back to Zorkel, his expression serious. I don't believe this was just an accident. This glue doesn't just get spilled by accident. There's something more to it. Why is this glue so strong? Where did it come from? Zorkel seemed taken aback. He had never thought about it that way. It's just a special kind of adhesive designed for experiments. It wasn't supposed to cause any harm. Experiment? Mr. Harris repeated. You've been using it on students. Zorkel hesitated. Not directly. It's part of a scientific demonstration. I didn't think it would. That's the problem, Mr. Harris interrupted. You didn't think. You didn't consider what could go wrong. And now my son is sitting here with his hair stuck in a mess of your experiment. If this is how you treat your students, then maybe you need to rethink how you run things around here. Zorkel took a step back, his 3 eyes wide with surprise. He wasn't used to humans speaking this way, especially not in front of other students. His species had always been the leaders, the ones in charge. But Mr. Harris wasn't like the other humans. He wasn't afraid to speak up when something wasn't right. James could see the tension in the room growing. The other students were watching closely, sensing the conflict. Some of them had never seen a human speak so boldly, especially in front of an alien teacher. But James wasn't afraid of his father. He trusted him completely. Mr. Harris looked around the room, his gaze strong. "This is a mistake, and I'm going to fix it. But I don't want to see this happen again. I want this experiment stopped. I want answers. And if I don't get them, there will be consequences." The room fell silent. The other students looked at each other, unsure of what to say. Zorkel opened his mouth to respond, but then he seemed to realize that there was nothing more to say. Mr. Harris had made his point. Finally, Zorkel nodded. "I understand. I will make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll take full responsibility for what happened." Mr. Harris gave a short nod. "Good, but right now my priority is my son, and I'm taking him out of here." Without another word, Mr. Harris stood up, gently guiding James out of his seat. James felt a wave of relief wash over him as his father's strong hand rested on his shoulder. He trusted his father completely, and he knew that whatever happened next, his dad would make sure everything turned out okay. "Let's go, James," Mr. Harris said. "We're going to fix this." As they walked out of the classroom, the other students watched in silence, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was certain: whatever happened, they would never forget the moment when a father stood up for his son, and nothing would ever be the same for them again. Let me know if you'd like to make any changes or if you want more details. Here's part 3. Father versus Teacher, written in third-person style with simple, engaging language in about 750 words. Part 3. Father versus Teacher. The hallway outside the classroom was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the lights overhead. Mr. Harris walked with steady steps, leading James toward the school's main office. His grip on his son's shoulder was firm but reassuring, a silent promise that everything would be all right. James, though still shaken by the embarrassing incident, could feel his father's strength and confidence surrounding him like a shield. He tried to hold his head up, but his sticky hair made it hard to feel normal. "I'm sorry, Dad," James mumbled, looking down at his feet. "Don't be," Mr. Harris replied in his usual calm voice. "You didn't do anything wrong. This is not your fault." James nodded but didn't say anything else. He knew his father was right, but it was hard to shake off the feeling of being humiliated in front of the entire class. He had been laughed at, and now he wasn't sure how things would go from here. Would the other students make fun of him tomorrow? Would he always be remembered as the kid who got glue in his hair? As they approached the office, the principal, an alien named Vlak, was waiting for them. Vlak was a tall, slender being with thin silver skin and large, glowing eyes. His face was usually calm, but now there was a look of concern as he saw Mr. Harris and James approaching. The principal was not used to dealing with problems like this. Most of the time, the human students were quiet and respectful. But today was different. "Mr. Harris," Vlak said, his voice smooth and calm, "I understand there has been an unfortunate accident. Zorkel explained the situation to me. We are very sorry for the trouble caused to your son. I assure you we will take care of this immediately." Mr. Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at the principal, his eyes steady and serious. "Zorkel already apologized, but I don't think that's enough. He made a mistake, a big one. This glue isn't just a minor problem. It's dangerous. And if it wasn't for me walking in, who knows what might have happened." Vlak blinked his large eyes. "We did not realize the full extent of the issue, but I assure you we will handle it. We have medical professionals who can help." "Medical professionals?" Mr. Harris repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Do you really think a nurse can fix this? This glue isn't just going to wash off with soap and water. It's not a simple mess. This is an experiment gone wrong. And it's not the first time something like this has happened, is it?" James stood quietly beside his father, listening to the conversation. He could see the tension building between his father and the principal. He had never seen his dad so serious, but part of him felt a strange sense of pride. His father wasn't backing down, and that made him feel stronger too. I don't understand, Vlach said, his voice softening as he looked between the two of them. It was never meant to harm anyone. Zorkel is an experienced teacher. This was an accident. A mistake, yes, Mr. Harris said, his voice sharp. But it goes deeper than that. Zorkel may have made an error, but this school has allowed these types of experiments to go on for too long. You've been using dangerous materials on your students without thinking about the consequences, and you don't seem to care until something like this happens. Well, it's time for a change. The room fell silent. James could feel the weight of his father's words hanging in the air. The principal was still processing what Mr. Harris had said, but there was no denying the truth in his words. The school had been too focused on impressing the alien students with high-tech experiments without paying enough attention to the safety of the human children. I'm not asking for a fight, Vlach, Mr. Harris continued. But I'm not going to let my son or any other human kid be treated like this again. You have a responsibility to every student in this school, not just the aliens, and you can't keep ignoring the human perspective. James could see that the principal was starting to understand. His glowing eyes flickered slightly, a sign of the deep thoughts running through his mind. Vlach was used to dealing with alien cultures, but he had never really taken the time to understand the human experience. It was always easy for the other species to assume humans were just another part of the galaxy, but Mr. Harris was showing him that humans had their own strength, their own voice. You're right, Mr. Harris, Vlach said after a long pause. We have made mistakes, and we will make changes. I will personally speak with Zorkel and make sure he understands the seriousness of this situation. We will also review the safety protocols in place for all experiments. Mr. Harris nodded. Good, but I want to make sure that this incident doesn't just disappear. I want the other parents to know what happened here. I want to make sure that no other kid gets hurt by someone's careless mistake. I agree, Vlach said, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. We will send a letter to all the parents explaining what happened and what steps we are taking to prevent it in the future. And I will make sure your son's hair is taken care of right away. We'll get the glue out without causing further damage. James felt a small wave of relief. At least his hair would be fixed. But more than that, he was proud of his father. Mr. Harris had stood up for what was right, and now things were going to change. Maybe the aliens didn't understand humans completely, but they would have to now. And James would be a part of that change. Thank you, Mr. Harris said simply, his voice softer now. That's all I'm asking for. Let's make sure no one else goes through this. As the conversation wrapped up, Mr. Harris put a hand on James' shoulder and led him toward the door. James walked beside his father, feeling stronger with each step. Today had been a nightmare, but his father had turned it into something much more. He wasn't just the kid with glue in his hair anymore. He was the son of a father who would fight for him, no matter what. Let me know if you need any changes or additional details. Here's part 4, unraveling the truth, written in third-person style with simple and engaging language in about 750 words. Part 4, unraveling the truth. The next morning, the atmosphere at Silver Star Academy felt different. The usual hum of excited chatter and the buzz of students preparing for class were overshadowed by a quiet tension. James walked through the hallway with his father, still feeling a mix of embarrassment and relief. The glue was finally out of his hair, thanks to the school's medical team, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As they entered the classroom, the students fell silent. Their eyes lingered on James, and he could feel their gazes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with unspoken judgment. He wanted to shrink into the shadows, but he stood tall, his head held high. His father's words echoed in his mind. You didn't do anything wrong. He clung to that truth, but the discomfort remained. Zorkel stood at the front of the room, his 3 eyes wide with guilt. He looked nervous, shifting from one foot to the other. The incident from the day before weighed heavily on him. He had never meant for things to spiral out of control, and now the truth was beginning to unravel. James took his seat and glanced at his father, who gave him a reassuring nod. Mr. Harris wasn't leaving until he knew everything. This wasn't just about fixing his son's hair anymore. It was about understanding why something as simple as a classroom experiment had turned into a disaster. Zorkel cleared his throat and began the lesson, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The students could tell that something had changed. There was a tension in the air, something unsaid but felt by everyone. Zorkel didn't make eye contact with James or his father. Instead, he focused on the screen in front of him, where he was showing a diagram of the experiment gone wrong. "I have reviewed the situation," Zorkel began, his voice faltering slightly. "I apologize for my actions yesterday. The glue that I used was supposed to be harmless, but I failed to realize how dangerous it could be. I will never make this mistake again." James' eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure what was going on, but there was something about Zorkel's words that didn't sit right with him. The alien teacher seemed too calm, too ready to take the blame. It was as if he was trying to cover something up. James couldn't understand why, but he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Was this all just a mistake, or was there more to the story? As the lesson continued, James couldn't concentrate. His mind was racing, and every time he looked at Zorkel, he felt a growing sense of unease. The teacher had apologized, but it didn't feel like enough. There had to be something more, something deeper behind the accident. Why had Zorkel used such a dangerous substance in the first place? And why hadn't he explained what it really was? James glanced over at his father, who was sitting quietly in the back of the room, watching everything unfold. Mr. Harris' eyes were sharp, scanning Zorkel's every movement. James could tell his father was thinking the same thing. There was more to this than Zorkel was letting on. Finally, Mr. Harris stood up, his voice cutting through the silence. "Zorkel," he said firmly, "I think it's time you tell us the truth." The room grew even quieter, and the students stared in confusion. Zorkel turned to face Mr. Harris, his 3 eyes blinking in surprise. He wasn't expecting to be challenged. "What do you mean, Mr. Harris?" Zorkel asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "I mean," Mr. Harris continued, "this isn't just about a little mistake with glue. There's something else going on here. You've been using this substance on your students, and you don't even know what it does. How is that possible?" Zorkel opened his mouth to speak, but then paused. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for the right words. It's a scientific experiment. The glue is designed to bond under pressure. It's supposed to help with research in the field of molecular bonding." James leaned forward, his curiosity growing. "Then why did it stick so fast? Why didn't you warn anyone about how dangerous it was?" Zorkel hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground. I didn't think it would be a problem," he admitted quietly. "The substance was created for advanced research purposes, but I didn't fully understand the risks when I introduced it to the class. It was a mistake." Mr. Harris took a step closer, his voice firm. "You didn't understand the risks? You brought a dangerous chemical into this classroom without knowing what it could do to a human child." Zorkel's 3 eyes met Mr. Harris' intense gaze. For the first time, he seemed truly unsure of himself. I didn't think it would react like this. The material is designed for alien biology, and I didn't take into account how it might affect humans. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." James frowned. "So you're saying you didn't know the glue could do this to me? You didn't know it would stick so fast?" Zorkel nodded slowly. "I didn't know, but I'm learning now, and I will make sure that something like this never happens again." There was a long silence in the room as the students processed what had just been revealed. James felt his anger rising. He had been treated like a science experiment, like his safety didn't matter. And the worst part was that Zorkel didn't even realize how serious his mistake had been. Mr. Harris stood tall, his eyes still locked on Zorkel. "I hope you've learned something from this," he said coldly. "Because the next time something like this happens, it won't just be my son I'm protecting. It will be every student in this school." Zorkel nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. "I will make the changes necessary. I will ensure that all experiments are safe for everyone. I promise." James, still angry but relieved, turned his gaze to the students. He realized something important in that moment. He wasn't just a kid who got glue in his hair. He was someone who stood up for what was right, and he wouldn't let anyone forget that. Let me know if you need any adjustments or additions. Here's part 5. A big reaction written in third-person style with simple and engaging language in about 750 words. Part 5. A big reaction. The news of the incident spread quickly throughout Silver Star Academy. What started as a quiet problem with one student's hair turned into something much bigger. By the end of the day, the teachers were talking, the students were whispering, and the parents were getting involved. And none of them could ignore the reaction that was coming. James had never felt so much attention on him in his life. It wasn't just the students looking at him now, but the whole school seemed to be buzzing about what had happened. Every time he walked down the hallway, he could hear snippets of conversation, some sympathetic, others full of judgment. It was as if his father's confrontation with Zorkel had sparked something bigger, something more serious. "Did you hear?" one student whispered as James passed by. The glue wasn't supposed to be dangerous, but it stuck to him so fast. What if it happened to one of us? "Mr. Harris really gave it to Zorkel, huh?" Another student murmured, "He's not like the other parents. He's serious." James didn't know how to feel about the attention. Part of him was relieved that his father had taken charge, but the other part of him wished everything would just go back to normal. He didn't want to be the center of attention anymore. He wanted to fade into the background like he had before the glue incident. But now, no one would let him forget it. The worst part came later that afternoon when the principal, Vlach, called a meeting. Mr. Harris was already there, sitting in a chair with his arms crossed. He wasn't angry, but there was a firmness in his posture that made it clear he wasn't going to back down. James sat beside him, feeling both nervous and proud of his father. Vlach stood in front of them, his silver skin glowing softly in the dim light. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Harris," he said in his calm, measured tone. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened yesterday. I understand that this is a serious matter, and we are investigating the situation thoroughly." Mr. Harris nodded. "I appreciate that, Vlach. But I need more than just an apology. We need to make sure this never happens again. My son isn't the only one at risk. I want a full investigation into why this glue was used in the first place." Vlach blinked his large, glowing eyes, a sign of hesitation. "We are already looking into it, but I assure you, this was a simple accident. Zorkel didn't mean for it to happen." "But it still happened," Mr. Harris replied firmly. "And now my son is going through this. There should never have been any risk in the first place." James could feel his father's determination in every word he spoke. Mr. Harris wasn't just defending him, he was defending every student in that school. He wasn't going to let this incident fade into the past without change. As the meeting continued, James couldn't help but notice that Vlach seemed more uncomfortable with each passing moment. The principal was used to dealing with students and their problems, but this situation was different. The way Mr. Harris had stepped in, so strong and unyielding, had shaken him. For the first time, Vlach seemed to be questioning his own decisions. "We have already issued a report to the other parents," Vlach said, breaking the silence. "We are promising to make changes to our safety protocols. We are also considering removing Zorkel from conducting experiments with human students until we are sure that everything is safe." James felt a wave of relief. He knew that the decision to remove Zorkel from experimenting on human students was the right one. No one should ever have to go through what he had. But he also knew that the change wasn't just about Zorkel, it was about the whole system. The school needed to understand that humans were not to be treated like test subjects. Mr. Harris sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Vlach. "Good," he said, "but it doesn't end there. I want all experiments reviewed. I want full transparency from now on. No more dangerous materials brought into the classroom without proper testing." Vlach nodded slowly. "I agree. We will review all procedures, and we will make sure this never happens again." For the first time in a while, James felt like the adults were finally starting to listen. But it wasn't just because of him. It was because his father had stood up. He had forced the school to recognize the dangers of their actions and to take responsibility. Just then, the door to the room opened and Zorkel stepped in. He looked uneasy, his 3 eyes darting around the room before settling on Mr. Harris. "Mr. Harris," he said quietly, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. I should have been more careful." Mr. Harris didn't respond right away. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke. "Zorkel, I know you didn't mean for this to happen, but your mistake affected my son. It affected all of us. And I want to make sure this never happens again." Zorkel nodded, his head hanging low. "I understand. I will make sure to follow all safety rules from now on. James felt his anger from the previous day starting to fade. He didn't know if he could fully forgive Zorkel yet, but he could see that the teacher was genuinely sorry. And that was all he could ask for. As the meeting came to an end, Vlach stood and offered his hand to Mr. Harris. "I appreciate your patience in this matter," he said. "We will work together to make sure this school is a safer place for all students." Mr. Harris shook his hand firmly. "I'm counting on you to keep that promise." As they left the office, James felt a strange mixture of relief and pride. Things were changing. The school was starting to listen. And it was all because his father had made a big reaction. Let me know if you need any changes or if you'd like to add more details. Here's Part 6, the showdown written in third-person style with simple and engaging language in about 750 words. Part 6, the showdown. The days following the meeting were filled with tension, and James couldn't escape the feeling that something big was about to happen. The atmosphere at Silver Star Academy had shifted. It wasn't just about his hair anymore. It was about the system, about the way the school treated its students, and about the dangerous risks they were willing to take. James wasn't sure how, but he knew the battle wasn't over. One afternoon, as James and his father walked into the school for another meeting with the principal, Mr. Harris seemed more serious than ever. He walked with purpose, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning every corner of the school as if he were looking for signs of trouble. James followed him, still a little nervous about what might happen next. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" James asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Harris stopped and looked at his son. His expression softened, but there was a fire in his eyes. "I'm sure, James. We've come this far. We're not backing down now. This needs to be fixed." James nodded. He didn't fully understand why it was so important to keep pushing. All he knew was that his father had a way of making people listen, and after everything that had happened, James didn't want the issue to be swept under the rug. As they entered the office, the usual calm of the room seemed out of place. Vlach stood at the center of the room, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Zorkel, the alien teacher, and a few of the senior staff members. They'd all looked uncomfortable, like they were bracing for something. "Mr. Harris," Vlach said, his voice strained. "Thank you for coming. I think we can finally resolve this matter today." But Mr. Harris wasn't here to talk things through quietly. He wasn't going to let this be just another meeting where nothing changed. "I hope so, Vlach. But I'm not here to discuss apologies anymore. I'm here to see real action." The room went silent, and the tension grew thick. Zorkel shifted nervously, his three eyes flicking between the people in the room. He clearly didn't want to be in this situation, but he was here because he had to be. "I've spoken with the board of directors," Vlach continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've reviewed all safety protocols, and we've decided that no more dangerous substances will be used in the classroom. Zorkel will no longer conduct experiments on human students until we're completely sure that everything is safe. We are committed to making changes." James could see that the principal was trying to do the right thing, but it didn't feel like enough. The incident had gone beyond the use of glue. It had become about trust, safety, and accountability. Mr. Harris wasn't satisfied with just a promise. He needed to see that the school was ready to act. "I'm glad to hear that," Mr. Harris said, his voice cool but firm. "But that's not all. This problem didn't just happen because of one mistake. There's a bigger issue at play here, and I want answers." The principal looked confused. "What do you mean, Mr. Harris?" "I mean," Mr. Harris said, his voice rising, "you've allowed your staff to run experiments on students without fully understanding the risks. You've treated them like test subjects instead of human beings. And now my son and other kids have paid the price. You're not just going to walk away from this with an apology and a few safety measures." The senior staff members exchanged nervous glances. They knew Mr. Harris was right, but none of them wanted to admit it. Zorkel was the one who had caused the accident, but the whole school system had been at fault for allowing it to happen. Zorkel stepped forward, his eyes downcast. I never meant for this to go so far. The experiments, they were supposed to help with new research. I never imagined they would hurt anyone." Mr. Harris crossed his arms, his eyes locked on the teacher. "You should have thought of that before you brought dangerous materials into this school. It's not just about research, it's about the safety of every student here." I want to know how this happened, and I want to know what you're going to do to fix it." Zorkel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I was told the materials were safe for all species, but I didn't consider the differences in biology. I didn't understand how the glue would react with human hair." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't angry at Zorkel anymore, but the truth was still hard to hear. The teacher had made a mistake. But what bothered James more was how the school had failed to prevent it. They had allowed an experiment to happen without fully understanding the consequences. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, his expression serious. "This isn't just about one experiment. This is about the way this school operates. I want a full investigation into how things like this are allowed to happen. And I want the parents to be informed. They'd have a right to know what's going on here." Vlach looked as though he were about to argue, but then he paused. He realized Mr. Harris was right. He couldn't just brush this off anymore. "You're right," he said slowly. "We will do everything in our power to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. We will open the investigation you're asking for, and we will make sure the parents are fully informed." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't over yet, but the school was finally listening. They weren't just offering apologies and promises anymore. They were taking action. Mr. Harris turned to his son and smiled, a small but proud smile. "It's going to be okay, James," he said softly. And for the first time since the incident, James believed it. "Let me know if you need further adjustments or additions." Here's Part 7. A new beginning written in third-person style with simple and engaging language in about 750 words. Part 7. A new beginning. It was the first day back after the long meeting, and the atmosphere at Silver Star Academy felt different. The hallway was quieter than usual, and the students seemed to be walking with a new sense of caution. James noticed it too. There was a change in the air, something had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like things were finally moving in the right direction. As he walked to his classroom, James couldn't help but feel a little nervous. He had been through so much in the last few days, and even though the school had promised change, he wasn't sure if he could trust them just yet. He wanted things to go back to normal, but he wasn't sure what normal was anymore. His father had been right. This wasn't just about the glue. It had always been about something bigger, something deeper. The way the school treated its students, the way they ran experiments without fully understanding the risks, it was all part of a system that needed to change. And now, because of his father's determination, that change was starting to happen. As James walked into the classroom, he was surprised to see a small crowd of students gathered around Zorkel. The alien teacher was standing at the front, looking a little more nervous than usual. He seemed to be trying to explain something, but James couldn't hear the words. He didn't want to get involved, but he was curious. Zorkel caught sight of James and gave him a small nod. "Ah, James," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "Good to see you back." James wasn't sure how to respond. Zorkel had apologized 100 times, but James still couldn't forget what had happened. He wasn't angry anymore, but he wasn't ready to just forgive and forget either. He took a deep breath and nodded back. "Thanks," he said quietly. As the day went on, the lessons felt different. There was a sense of caution now, a new awareness that hung in the air. The teachers moved more carefully, double-checking everything they said and did. The students, too, seemed to be taking a little more care in their actions. It was as if everyone had learned a lesson from what had happened. When the bell rang for lunch, James found himself walking with his friends, but he didn't feel quite the same. They were talking about the latest school gossip, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. "Hey James, are you okay?" his friend Luke asked, noticing his silence. "You've been kind of quiet today." James hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I'm fine, just thinking, I guess." Luke raised an eyebrow. "About what?" James looked around the lunchroom, noticing how everyone was speaking in hushed voices. "About how things are different now. The school's changing. And I guess I'm changing too." Luke didn't say anything at first, but then he nodded. "Yeah, I can see that. You've been through a lot lately, but I think you're right. Things do feel different." James smiled faintly. "It's like we're all learning something new." The rest of the lunch period passed in a blur. But as the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The school was taking responsibility for what had happened, and it was finally ready to change. Zorkel was still teaching, but the experiments would be different from now on. The administration had promised that they would never again take the same risks with students' safety. When James arrived home that evening, his father was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a report. His mother was making dinner, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. James could tell his father was exhausted, but there was a quiet pride in his eyes. "How was school today?" Mr. Harris asked, setting down the report. James shrugged. "Different. I think things are starting to change. People are more careful. It feels like we're all learning from what happened." Mr. Harris smiled and ruffled his son's hair. "I'm proud of you, James. You were strong through all of this. You didn't let the school just sweep it under the rug." James smiled back. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. You were the one who made them listen." His father's smile grew even wider. "We did it together, and I'm glad you see that. It wasn't just about fixing your hair or making sure the glue didn't hurt anyone else. It was about making sure the school understood that we have a right to feel safe. And we've made a real difference." James nodded. He felt the weight of his father's words sink in. The battle wasn't just about one incident. It was about making sure that every student felt heard, understood, and protected. It was about changing the way things had always been done and making sure the mistakes of the past didn't repeat themselves. As he sat down at the table for dinner, James couldn't help but feel like something had been reset. The problems hadn't disappeared, but they felt smaller now, less important. The fight for safety, for change, had been won, and with it came the promise of a better future for everyone at Silverstart Academy. For the first time in a long time, James looked forward to tomorrow. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He would always stand up for what was right, no matter what. And with that, the beginning of something new had started.